Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to California on the Ballot, the fourth branch, Media and Democracy. I'm Julie Fry, I'm President and CEO of California Humanities, and we're a 45-year-old independent nonprofit partner of the National Endowment for the Humanities, and we focus on connecting the people of California through the public humanities by making grants and delivering programs across the state that help us learn together about our histories, cultures, experiences. California on the Ballot is a series of virtual events like this focused on issues of electoral engagement in California that we'll be producing through the end of the month. It's supported by the Why It Matters Civic and Electoral Participation Initiative administered by the Federation of State Humanities Councils and funded by the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. So we are very grateful to them for making this happen. Just one little piece of housekeeping to you. The chat room is your space to connect with each other and to join the conversation. And we ask that you write any questions for the panelists into the Q&A part of Zoom. So we're very excited to bring together this really excellent panel today, looking forward to it. And I'm going to turn us over to Dr. Ray Briggs, who is Professor of Philosophy at Stanford University and co-host of the Philosophy Talk radio show. Their research explores how the formal models can help us reason better. In addition to over 20 philosophy articles, Ray has published 2 poetry collections and been nominated for Pushcart Prize. So over to you, Ray, and thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Julie. I'd like to introduce all of our panelists, starting with Tasmeen Raja, who is the editor-in-chief of the Oaklandside, a nonprofit newsroom for Oakland, California. She's a former senior editor for NPR's Code Switch team, which explores issues of race and identity in America, and an editor at Mother Jones Magazine, where she focused on data-driven investigations. Welcome, Tasmeen.
Thank you, it's great to be here.
Next, I'd like to introduce Reyna Olaguez, who's the executive director of South Kern Sol, a youth-led nonprofit media website focused on shining a light on health disparities that exist across Kern County. Welcome, Reyna.
Thank you, Ray, for having me.
Next, I'd like to introduce Megan Garvey, who's the executive editor of KPCC and LAist, a public media newsroom that serves Southern California with the goal of delivering original, distinctive, and ambitious reporting. She was previously a deputy managing editor for the LA Times. Megan, welcome.
I'm looking forward to our conversation today.
And finally, I'd like to introduce Sarah Stierch, who's an independent journalist using social media to report on wildfires and North Bay culture and civic engagement, based in Sonoma, California. She also serves as research director of Bischoff Improvement Performance Counseling. Sarah, welcome.
Good afternoon. Thanks for having me.
So I'd like to begin our panel with a topic of local news. In recent years, the media landscape has seen the emergence of nonprofit news. So what is nonprofit news and what exactly brought it about?
Sure, well, I'm happy to jump in. As a journalist, I've been working in nonprofit news for the past nearly 12 years at the largest nonprofit news organization in the country, that's National Public Radio, to arguably the smallest, which is the community news platform I founded in East Texas. And there's a common denominator here, whether you're talking about, a scrappy grassroots operation or, a legacy media company that's been around for decades. The fundamental premise here is that market solutions are no longer viable, sustainable, reliable when it comes to making sure that communities across our country have access to the information that they need and deserve to be full, empowered members of our civic society. So for many decades, major metro papers enjoyed monopolies when it came to information distribution and enjoyed monopolies when it came to local advertising. So you could make a real go of it and produce fantastic city hall coverage, investigative reporting, dining, travel, real estate, all of these sections that no longer even exist, through advertising and subscriptions alone for the most part. There were other sources of revenue as well. These days, of course, that landscape has changed completely. And those of us in the nonprofit news space see this as a real opportunity, actually, not just a challenge, but an opportunity to reframe the debate and say, journalism is a public good, it is a civic good, and the way that we think about the need to support and sustain the arts and museums and libraries and food trusts and so on through community support, because that's the way we want our communities and our society to function, we now need to recognize that journalism has always been a provider of the civic public good in a similar way. It just used to be commercially profitable to do so at the local level. It no longer is. If you're the New York Times, if you're the Washington Post, you'll be fine. But if you're in Oakland, California, or you are in Tyler, Texas, we are saying, let's create structures through which people in communities can actually play a role, a direct role in ensuring that they have access to the information that they want and need.
So it sounds like for you, there's a real link between local news and nonprofit news. Does that resonate with our other panelists?
You know, I think I would say that it's interesting what Tasneem's getting at is that, you know, yeah, they used to mint money in local print journalism. I mean, they made, you know, double, high, teen profits routinely just through advertising, and that whole model has collapsed. And in its collapse, there has been opportunity, but I think there's also challenges, right? So public media operates under the we have to persuade you that we're providing you value, right? Because everyone, it only works if people give, right? And they don't have to give. Most of us don't have paywalls, right? Especially in public radio, public media. So you actually are in a position of having to do work that is valuable to people and talk to them about why there's value there, and then count on them to sustain you. And I think that, for a long time, there wasn't necessarily a lot of original reporting done in like the traditional like NPR affiliate world, right? There's a lot of reliance on what the local paper was doing, a lot of like study kind of stuff. And as we find that there are these news deserts all throughout the country, and as we know that, public radio in particular covers most of the country, there's also this challenge of how does it rise to the occasion and do that kind of ambitious, meaningful local reporting that frankly won't get done otherwise. And it's a cycle, because it's not just that it's the right thing to do, and it does matter for our democracy, absolutely. But I also think it's our job to also make it clear the value of doing that reporting, the value of journalism, and then that becomes sustaining. And I think that that's a business model that makes sense, and it relies on the value of having in our democracy a free press, literally free press, but that's sustained by people understanding why it is valuable and necessary in order to have, more equitable communities, accountability in our communities. And what heartens me is a lot of people have risen to the occasion, do believe that, and have sustained these organizations. You see the Lion Publishers, which is an independent publishers organization that's providing a toolkit, that's providing all the sort of structural things that you got out of being from a really big newsroom. How do we band together as more independent publishers, recreate some of that ecosystem, and make it possible for us to fill in these gaps? And also, I think importantly, reinvent what it means to be a news story, what it means to be reflective of the community, and to get away from the kind of systems coverage that I think has left a lot of people frustrated and a lot of communities alienated or uncovered.
Yeah, I know a lot of you have talked about what news means and not having a too narrow conception of what news means. And I would be really curious to hear from any of you about that.
Hi, Ray. So I could jump in on this one. So we're located in Kern County. Kern County is very geographically dispersed, and our mainstream media outlets tend to stay in like the center of in Bakersfield, right, the city. And so oftentimes it's created these media deserts in the rural communities. And oftentimes our communities that live in Arvin or in Delano, they don't see themselves represented in the local media. We have reporters that come in, stay here for a year, and so there's no really relationship building. And so that's when we came in. South Kern Sol, we teach young people to be journalists. We teach them journalism skills. They write stories. They live in the communities that they report on. And so they have relationships. They start building a network, and they tell the stories that and highlight disparities and shine a light on health issues or anything that's happening in their community that's important to them. And so they have the opportunity to go out and to report and interview the teacher that's doing amazing work, because they have that power. And we don't have to worry about selling ads in our newspaper. We get to focus on the fun part of journalism, which is storytelling, and also holding decision makers accountable and boards accountable. I think that's also very important. Yeah, just wanted to say that. Thank you.
I'm happy to jump in here with an example as well. I love hearing about all of the work that's happening in the communities that we're serving. At the Oaklandside, starting in January, we realized there was a real opportunity for us to come in and not only report on the questions of, how is the vaccine rollout happening? How is access going to work? But we actually said we can go further and think about not just providing news, but provide an information service. So we set up a text hotline, essentially a text messaging service, where anybody can text us questions about, am I eligible? When will I be eligible? What do I need to take with me when I go to a vaccine appointment? Where can I get vaccinated? Why is it so hard to make an appointment? What's with these websites? So we started a print postcard and flyer campaign alongside this. And we said, we can't just wait for people to come to us and assume that, oh, if you're interested in the vaccines, you'll find the Oaklandside. You're probably a news junkie. A lot of people who are news junkies are not the people who are going to have the hardest time getting access to vaccines, right? So we said, let's start a print flyer and postcard campaign. Let's go into Oakland's hardest hit neighborhoods and work with libraries, churches, convenience stores, and so on to post these, distribute these materials. It has the phone number for the text service. We partnered with a Spanish language media organization in Oakland as well to direct to their Spanish language text service. And what we found immediately was like the questions we were starting to get when we started this work, where it was just nuts and bolts, again, those questions of, am I eligible? What do I do? How do I sign up? So we're doing both. We're doing the traditional reporting around, okay, what's next on the vaccine front? What's happening with this particular site? There's all these questions about vaccine access codes. Let's go do some reporting. But we're not stopping with the idea that we're just a news provider. We are also at heart an information provider. And I think that this is one of the spaces where nonprofit local newsrooms have and are really grabbing and relishing this opportunity to reimagine what journalism can look like at the local level. And, we see that trickle up to the national level as well in some interesting ways.
Just to echo Tasneem, I think, we had a series a couple of years ago now on looking at Black infant mortality. And the reporter on that series, who's now heading the Southeast hub for NPR, she had a goal of not just reporting on the sad statistics about what was going on, but also having actual change. And so when, we've done this process a couple different times of human-centered design, where you really like stop and you think about like, well, what ultimate impact do you want to have? What is the effect of the reporting you want to have? And what she wanted to do was she wanted to help women have better outcomes. So then it's like, okay, well, is that our audience? Is that like realistically like the NPR listening audience at KPCC? it wasn't. I mean, a certain percentage, but small. So then that meant you had to define, well, where was that community actually in existence, and how were they getting their information? And that resulted in things like we sent out postcards to zip codes of that had a high percentage of Black women of childbearing age. We did in-person events. She went on social media early in the process, not at the end, to talk about her reporting process, and she gathered people along as she went. And I think that that's more and more something that we have to think about. I mean, when I started in journalism, which is a while ago now, you did your story, and I kind of joke about it, but I'm not even joking. You do your big investigation and you take your vacation, just when the world was learning about what you had found out. And so there was no you're completing the story was your job. And whether and a lot of the impact stuff was related, to be really frank, more to winning awards than it was to actually making a difference. And so I think when you think about it in a much more actionable way and really have to game out what you're trying to accomplish, it's an area that I think a lot of really traditional journalists, they get a little bit, they're not sure they're comfortable, right? Is that really my job? Is that advocacy? And it's but as you say, we are advocates for the truth. We are, is it bad to want people to not have their babies die before they were a year old? So it's being more sort of straightforward in what we're trying to accomplish, and then more intentional in how you get there. And I think that that's a pretty substantial change for how journalism was done when I started out.
This actually brings us really nicely to kind of the next planned topic, which is, so the media is sometimes called the fourth estate or the fourth branch, which alludes to its power in shaping public understanding of government and civic life and its impact on electoral engagement. So how does this idea resonate with you as journalists and editors and directors of news organizations?
Well, it's an interesting philosophical question, Ray, because it's come up even with our board, where they'll say, if you're telling someone to vote, is that advocacy? And it's it's an interesting question. We started something called, we called it the Human Voter Guide. This is probably, it predates my time at KPCC. But it was what happened was we sent someone out into the world, Mary Plummer, who was covering politics, to ask what people wanted to know about an upcoming election. And what we found out was they wanted to know how to vote. They weren't deep into the issues or the down ballot. They lacked basic civics information to allow them to be full participants in our democracy. And I think there's a lot of journalists who'd be well, is that really journalism? And I think I would say, yes, it is, because that's what someone's need is. They don't necessarily need to know someone's tax policy. They need to know, how do they register to vote? Where do they go? And so that was sort of revelatory. And I think a lot of places and a lot of the women on this call are trying to get at those issues and tackle those areas in their own coverage. And it is a real change in how things used to be done. It's voter guides are great, but did we ask whether we were providing the information people needed? And I think the answer used to be no. And I think it's increasingly yes. But then I think you're getting into this area of well, what is our responsibility? And certainly living through the last administration as citizens and journalists was an experience that I don't think anyone had had before. And I think really brought a lot of these questions to a head, right? The both sidesism, the sort of the gamesmanship of politics, as opposed to the effect on people's lives and the policies that were getting enacted.
It's interesting when it comes to, I alluded to some of the traditional sections of newspapers that once were huge revenue and subscriptions drivers for daily metros, right? Your travel guides, your travel section, your dining section, your real estate section, your schools guides. We were always comfortable with the idea that you might be providing actionable information to resourced people. You might be helping somebody figure out, where should I go eat tonight? Where should I go and take my family on vacation? Where should I send my child to school? We were always okay with that. And we didn't look at, a school guide published in a city magazine or, a daily newspaper or whatever the case may be and say, is that journalism? We just felt if you're getting information to people who want this information, great. I think what Megan is getting at is like the very crucial question of who are we serving and who have we not been serving and why not? And are we actually living up to our own missions if we are failing to serve vast swaths of the communities we say we're here to cover? You know, so if you cover Oakland, but you're comfortable providing information to people who have disposable income, disposable time, who have time to read articles and get really in the weeds on, you know, power skirmishes between, you know, various political candidates, we're okay with that. Why are we not okay with the idea that we're going to help parents figure out where to get their kids Chromebooks during a time of distance learning? To me, if we reframe journalism away from this narrow idea of news and we frame ourselves more in the direction of information and information providers, it starts to get us away from these very constricting and actually sort of mission, you know, mission misaligned conversations about, but is it journalism?
So one concept that's sort of coming up in my brain from this discussion is the concept of legitimacy. So like a concept of legitimacy that it sounds like you've all been rejecting and that you should reject, is that legitimacy is like about winning prizes and like getting published in a prestigious outlet. Is there like, is there a better concept of like legitimate news that we should be striving for instead?
If I can, hi. So I don't write for a publication anymore, and I'm not affiliated with a nonprofit news organization. I do my own thing, using, and at this point, mainly social media, because I didn't see the kind of information that I provide. It's often information. You know, I don't usually say I'm a news reporter or I report about news or so forth, but I'm often questioned on my legitimacy, even though I have a lot of experience, and I used to be a food and wine journalist, and I used to, you know, write for major magazines and newspapers and publications. And I often find myself having, you know, kind of being like ashamed because I'm not affiliated with a publication anymore, and that somehow makes me less legitimate. And it's unfortunate, you know, it's a form of imposter syndrome I'm still at times having to deal with, because people don't take me seriously, even my colleagues, because I report on a Facebook, I write on Facebook, or I write on Twitter, or I write something on Instagram. So they go, well, you're a social media influencer, you aren't a journalist. And I find it kind of insulting. I mean, sure, we're all influencers here, you know, before influencer meant social media, but the fact that the information I share with people is helping them, inspiring them, engaging them, because I use a lot of humor and such in my writing, to me means that my work is just as legitimate as the journalist working for the newspaper 5 blocks away from my house, still getting underpaid and being overworked. And I think the fact that people choose to donate to me as an individual via Venmo, when I write about wildfire reporting, or I write about a new restaurant that opened up, or I share information on how to get your COVID test after I shared my experience with doing it, doesn't make me any less of a journalist than the amazing, talented people I'm sitting here with. I just choose to use different platforms. And I look forward to the day, as a member of the National Press Club who lived in DC and worked out there for many years, that I can walk in and people don't roll their eyes at me when I say, oh, I wrote that article on Facebook. You know, so we'll see.
I do think what both Sarah and Tasneem are getting at is, you know, I tell people, like, you know, one of the things they need to do is be a human. And I think that that's something that was sort of absent from a lot of mainstream journalism, you know, the sense that like we're actual human beings who are experiencing life too. And I think, you know, what Sarah's doing is reaching people where they're actually getting their information. And that's smart. That's good. And I think, like, you know, that's a real change, right? In terms of like what our channels and how we distribute information. And I think another thing that stuck with me from, I read this probably 15 years ago, the criticism of sort of traditional journalism outlets online, at least in the beginning, was that they'd failed to be useful. And I think that's part of what we're getting at here, right? It's like, it is part of our job to make things accessible to people and to pay attention to how they consume information and where they consume information, and not dictate like it has to be the specific source or the specific place. And I think that that's an evolution that's definitely we're in the middle of still, and like kind of how do we think differently about that. And I do think I at one point I had someone say to me, I was trying to talk about how do we pay attention to the stories that people are that resonate with people, that they share, that they spend time on, and how do we use that to do that more frequently, right? So that if no one read the story, how great a story was it? If no one shared the story, it's like there's a reality there, right? To that. And someone said to me, they were like, well, I'm a serious journalist. And I thought, well, I'm pretty sure I'm a serious journalist as well. But I also felt like being a serious journalist should mean that you actually care about these things. Like, what information do people need? Like, what format do they want to get it in? Are you making it understandable to them? To me, those are all aspects of serious journalism. It's not just like writing like you're a disembodied voice, and I think that that's an important change. And I think you see that in the success that non-traditional journalists are having in spaces where, look, you didn't used to have access. You'd have to have millions of dollars to operate a printing press, right? That the whole paradigm has shifted in really fundamental ways. And there's been challenges to it. There's been positives, there's been negatives, but that's where we're living now. That's the space we're living in now. And I think that means it's all of our responsibility to make the most of that new space.
I would love to add to that, Megan, and what Sarah said about using Facebook, because it's really opened up, a very important, something very important for community news like ours. So what we do is that, we use a lot of our website, our platform, to create public awareness around issues that programs that are available to them that maybe Spanish-speaking community may not know of, or community members, because we know that folks have like checked out of local media. It's rare, right? People are on Facebook. And so one of the things that we do is that we will sponsor or place an ad of a certain public awareness that we think is super important. Most recently, we are placing ads to let the community know about a clinic in their community. That's a community clinic in partnership with a whole bunch of nonprofit organizations. And so there's been clinics in this community, but one of the clinics was charging a $38 administrative fee. And so when we brought access, we got the community to show up, and they just felt, they felt invited. They needed that push. And we were getting messages on Facebook, asking us the questions that Tasmeen said. Is a vaccine safe? Can I take the vaccine if I'm 18? Or, all these questions. And so we ended up dedicating 2 of our youth to answering these questions, because we were getting hundreds of them a day. And so I'm so honored and, just blessed to be in a position like this, to be able to communicate the information that our community needs, especially during the time of the pandemic. We now know how important the community newsrooms are to our communities, especially because I feel like we have a heart, we care about what the community needs, and we were going to try to get to fill their needs, whatever it is.
Yeah, and if I can just add in that the town I live in is a town of 12,000 people, and we have a newspaper that's part of a larger conglomerate of North Bay newspapers, and they publish twice a week, Tuesdays and Fridays. And then we have a small independent newspaper that is bless its heart, it's amazing, it's awesome. They also only publish every other week. And so we are limited on the amount of news we have locally, and we're in a very isolated area in wine country that has literally like two or three roads in and out. And, you know, we often are missed out on the boat of coverage from other publications outside of our community. So doing what I'm doing, I understand what, you know, Reyna is mentioning, you know, especially about trying to distribute information to our target population, which is, you know, for me, it is the everyday human being, not necessarily the wealthy people who are still, you know, we have a lot of white wealthy folks who are still getting the newspaper delivered to them and are watching MSNBC all day. But, you know, I'm a monolingual person, but I'm lucky enough, like say when I'm doing emergency and fire reporting, I'm reporting constantly. I'm awake 24 hours a day for, you know, weeks on end during fire season. And I'm able to work now with a group of amazing people who can interpret my tweets and my Facebook posts so they can share it with our Latino and Latinx community. And it's a very empowering because I can do what I want when I want to, because I don't have an editor, you know, overlooking me. But at the same time, the decline of local media in our community has been detrimental to the health, the safety, the welfare, and the civic engagement of our community members who have no clue what's going on with the city council unless I post an article, a blurb about it on my Twitter feed, you know? So the more we can engage people through these common platforms, whether we love to hate Facebook, we can't stand how Twitter's operated sometimes, Instagram, etc. I commend anybody who can go out and like interact with their community that way and engage more young people, you know? I think it's awesome.
So I want to move on to sort of my next question, which is related to this conversation, I think, which is, does journalism have a civic mission in democracy, or can it have a civic mission in democracy? And what limits are imposed on that by journalistic ethics?
I'm going to say yes and yes, but Tasmeen, go for it.
I think we've touched on that in a number of ways. I mean, I think it's pretty clear to me that all of us, you know, here would say, yes, of course, you know, journalism has always had a civic mission. We're called the fourth estate, right? I mean, the idea that you have to have a free, healthy, you know, certainly a free press, and I would say, you know, free and healthy press is enshrined in our Constitution, the idea of this connection between freedom of the press and a functioning democracy. So, you know, I don't have much to say here beyond a wholehearted, full-throated yes, but to say that, you know, one of the things that I want to see more news providers grapple with is, you know, a lot of like what Megan's getting at in terms of how are we making the case that you want to spend time with the information that we're putting out there. It's just no longer enough for us to sort of sit back and say, you know, we throw it out there, it's on you to catch the ball and run with it. Because there's just too many alternatives now, right? Like we no longer as journalism producers have the kind of monopoly over people's attention that we used to have. Used to be that if you wanted to know anything from what's going on in the stock market to what happened in China to, you know, what's, you know, who's running for city council in my district, you had to turn to your local daily paper. Now there are countless and ever increasing permutations of ways to get that information. Some good, some bad, some operating in good faith, some operating in bad faith. So we have to work a lot harder to see ourselves not only as, you know, journalists, but as producers, distributors, designers, you know, audience-centric design thinkers. All of it matters now. And so I think, you know, I would say that journalism not only has a civic mission, but I really like how Megan is putting it, this sort of idea of like human-centered design. Like this is one of the most important ways that we can continue to fulfill on our civic missions, is to really truly leave behind this mentality of like, we're here to just sort of report the story, put it out there, rinse and repeat, move on. When I talk to my newsroom, one of the things I like to say often is like, what if publishing the story is not the end point of our work, but it's like the midpoint of our work, or it's just the starting point? Like, okay, we put the information out there, but now the real work begins. How are we getting it to the people who need it most? How are we helping people continue the conversation? How are we bringing more voices, more perspectives, more questions into the discussion? How are we creating feedback cycles, with our readers, with our audiences, to say, okay, we put this out there. Was it useful to you? Did it make sense to you? What are you going to do with this information? Like, help us get better at this. So, when we launched the Oaklandside, we actually did not launch with a fully formed idea of what we were and what we were here to do. We actually spent months going around the community on kind of a listening tour, saying, we didn't have a name at that point. We didn't have a website. We didn't have anything. What we had were questions. We would meet with artists and small business owners and healthcare practitioners and local elected officials, and say, tell me about a time in the last 12 months where there was something you wanted to do in Oakland or needed to do in Oakland that you couldn't do very well because there was some information you didn't have. And now looking back, you get, oh, it's because I didn't know XYZ. But at the time, you didn't even know what you didn't know. That's where we want to come in. So, yes, we absolutely have a civic mission to play. And B, in this era, we have to get really smart and nimble and creative about how we're going to fulfill on that civic mission.
I would just say, I just want to underscore that what Tasneem's talking about is, is a real significant change from how things had been done, right? And I would say to her, I agree with her on the midpoint part of the publication of a story, because ideally in this new world order, you would have engaged people along the way. And the old way was like, you'd kind of like put your, it was like your arms were around your dinner. You didn't want anyone to see what was on your plate. You would hide it away. And in the process of hiding it away, you didn't bring people along, and you probably missed out on information that might have made your story better, stronger, more interesting, more compelling. And then I also think she's 100% right that, once you publish, that's not that you're not done. If you have established like the coverage areas that are meaningful to your audience, and you have designed a way of communicating that isn't an endpoint and instead is a conversation, and I think that that's when you engage with people like that, that's when you see people supporting the work, right? Because they do feel included and they do have a sense of belonging. And I see, especially at the local news level, I think those are really critical aspects to building community, which is really kind of what we're talking about here, right? We're talking about, making our communities healthier places, better places to be, which I think to the question of advocacy or the role in civic life, I think I'm very comfortable with the idea that as a journalist, I am here to improve the quality of life for the people in my community. I mean, I don't see that as being at odds with any kind of traditional ethics, or I just don't, and there's probably people who would disagree, but I've found that that's where I feel most purposeful, and that's why I have, spent the vast majority of my career in local journalism, admittedly in a big place, but, still local journalism.
Yeah, so this brings me to the last question before we open it up to audience questions, which is about citizen journalists. So, residents without formal training who use social media and firsthand camera footage to break stories and circulate photos and videos in real time. And so this has raised some existential question about who and what is considered journalism. And I'd just like to invite all of you to weigh in on who is a journalist and what is journalism.
I always have a lot of thoughts about this because people often call me a citizen journalist because I don't have a journalism degree, I guess. And again, because I use social media a lot. And I interact with a lot of citizen journalists, and especially during wildfire season. There's a whole contingent of people we call fire Twitter and fire Facebook. And they all, that's what we do. We work together, we collaborate a lot. There are some folks I trust more than others because of where they get their information, how they interpret information. And that is where, to me, there can be quite a shift and quite a difference, is often how people collect, process, and analyze the data and information that people need to digest. I've noticed a few folks in the Q&A, somebody had mentioned sensationalism, and I can be a drama queen on my social media. I have no shame admitting that. And I have been quite dramatic in some of the articles I've written as an editorialist, but I often have seen folks in Facebook groups, there's a lot of Facebook groups out there, the community groups, and people will say, oh, I'm a citizen journalist, and they're so dramatic and so scary, when it comes to especially emergency information, COVID testing. That to me is where I, as a journalist using social media to report, kind of draw the line on who I want to work with, I guess you could say, in that sphere of collaboration. And to me, it's the fear mongering, it's sensationalism, it's where you get your information from. And to me, that's and how it's presented is how I often gauge it. So
I'd actually love to hear how Reyna's students view themselves. Like, how do they see their role?
Yeah, our young people, they call themselves youth journalists, youth reporters, and it took us a while to get people to answer the phone, for an interview, and so, but now we're here 10 years later, and we're getting story leads. We get a call from someone that tells us, hey, you should tune into this a board meeting because there's something very funny going on there. Someone just said this about something. So we're at the point where we get our calls answered, and they see themselves as journalists. They come in, they go through an orientation, 2-day orientation. We get local journalists that come in and help us train our young people and teach them best practices. So we kind of give them the license to put their journalism hat on and look out for stories. And we've been doing a great job at doing that and lifting up youth voice and really issues that impact their communities. When they come in, we ask them, what are some of the issues that are important to you? And so this is when they check off the box. Immigration is important to me, or water access, just the different things that impact these communities. And so they come in, and that's how they start pitching their stories. Thank you, Megan.
So we have a lot of really good questions from the audience, and I think I want to ask some of them a little early because there are many and they're good. So Kathy Archibald writes, I think it's gotten more difficult to tell the difference between journalism and advertisement, and similarly between journalism/information and opinion/possible misinformation. Do you all think that there should be some sort of changes to regulations or structure that could help the consumer?
I mean, this is such
I think.
Go ahead.
Sure, I'd love to hear from you on this as well, Megan. This is one of the, at any given time, there's kind of like 5 questions in our industry that everybody's kind of obsessing about, fighting about, and offering good solutions about. And I think what Kathy, you're asking about, opinion versus straight news, but also opinion versus possible misinformation. I mean, that like gets at the core of one of the most urgent and pressing debates of the moment. So I mean, there's a lot there, and then it's interesting too that the question is about like regulation, because there's a number of ways you could get at this, right? Like, number one, I love associations like Lion Publishers, for instance, or the Institute for Nonprofit News, which are these like umbrella organizations that a number of sites across the country and really across the world can become part of if they agree to abide by the editorial ethics and policies of these organizations. So if you join the Institute for Nonprofit News, there's a bunch of benefits that come from that. Like they help you with fundraising, they help you get access to like vendors and legal services and things like that. But you have to promise and pledge to abide by their ethics policies. So that's one of the places where I think some of the best thinking and some of the most effective kind of change making and like thought leadership is happening and should happen in our community, in our industry. Government regulations, I mean, just as a journalist, I'm really not interested in kind of like government mandated definitions of what is and is not journalists. I think like that is a slippery slope that none of us wants to go down. So the industry needs to do I think a much better job of kind of like policing itself. And some of it comes to like, there's a lot of internal inside like knowledge that journalists have. By journalists, I'm not just talking about reporters, I'm talking about editors, I'm talking about the designers and the developers and like everybody. We as journalism professionals, there's assumptions that we bring to the table around, oh yeah, people understand that like this is in the opinion section. So they get that, Tom Friedman or Brett Stevens or whoever at the New York Times is an opinion writer, and they're not the same as, our DC correspondents. No, a lot of people don't know that. And especially because it works differently on the New York Times than it does at the Chicago Tribune or the Oaklandside or whatever the case may be. So there's a lot of, there aren't enough norms across our industry and like standards across our industry. Then you also talked about the difference between journalism and advertisement. And I'm happy to see that I do think in the last 5 or 10 years, if a site was to run like a sponsored story. A lot of publications do this, from BuzzFeed to, small local nonprofit organizations. If there is, let's say, I'm just making this up, like a pharmaceuticals company in your, area of coverage that wants to tell a story about some new breakthrough, patent it's working on, and your journalists aren't interested in telling that story, there are publications that say you can buy some space if you'd like to tell this story, but you have to slap a big, kind of like sticker basically saying sponsored story, and this story was paid for Bayer or whoever the case may be. Some sites do a really good job of signaling this was not produced by our reporters, this was produced by this company, and others don't. And I'm only right now talking about stuff that's happening on like, official news sites, like journalism platforms. I think there's also, when you get into social media and you get into, a number of other outlets, you've got, independent producers who are doing fantastic, rigorous, really well vetted journalism. And then you also have people who are just kind of out there like throwing stuff around. Again, I would never come down on the side of like government regulation of these things. I think this is where professional associations have a lot to offer and also have a lot of work left to do.
I think there's 2 key things here, right? One is media literacy, and that's what Tasneem's getting at. It's like, when I was still working for the LA Times and it was under the Tribune, later Trunk Empire, again, Tribune Empire anyway. There was a famous thing where this whole new group of people came in to own the LA Times, and one of the main guys like had no idea that that Dateline Baghdad at the beginning of the story meant that the reporter was reporting from Baghdad, and like all the journalists kind of laughed and said, oh, what an idiot. But like, how do people know that? What seems obvious to us might not be obvious to a reader. And I think, so there's a media literacy component, and then I think there's a transparency component. I see this question from Drew Mendelson, how something is told is as important as what is told. How do we ensure what is told is true? And I think that that's like the media literacy part of it is like being knowledgeable about where you're getting your information. But I think that news organizations can go way further than they do and like actually explain how they're reporting the story and who's assigned to it and who they talk to and link to original source material and be much clearer about where the information is coming from. I remember when I was starting out is a very young reporter in Chicago, and I was reporting on this. There's this terrible story about, I think it was 19 children who were found home alone in an apartment in absolutely, just egregious, filthy conditions. And I was working on it, and I was feeding, I was sending my account to another reporter, and then the New York Times the next day had this like epic account. They had like people, I mean, it was like crazy, and they had one name on it, because at the time at the New York Times you could only have one byline. And so even though like an army of people worked on it, it's like that kind of thing. Like we can do more to be transparent about the process. There's been a whole movement, which I 100% agree with, on like crediting more people, being more transparent about who worked on a story, including the editing and the copy. In a big institution, obviously, I'm talking about places that have some resources, but even in smaller places, to say, Sarah, if you're saying, well, I was there at the fire, or I watched, just being much clearer about where our information has come from, and acknowledging that a lot of the things that we assume people know, because we've probably all been doing this since we were kids, aren't general knowledge to everyone who doesn't like live in this space all the time. And we definitely saw the effects of that, I think, in the initial coverage of, the 2016 election, and then in how the struggle over how to cover, an administration that was very different from other administrations.
Yeah, I just, if I could just chime in really quick, it's for me, a lot of folks will say, how do you know that? How did you get that information? And we've seen that in the past, with the most recent administration, especially. It's like the decline in naming your sources. I get it. We can't name every source, and there are incidences and situations and stories. I totally get it. But I think we've kind of gotten used to it, especially with political reporting. And again, I under it with the leaks, that were coming out of the White House or whatever it is, and even in local media. And as somebody who people rely on, not to sound like some drama queen, but people rely on my reporting during one of the most critical moments maybe of their life, when people are literally, their houses are burning down and they're trying to evacuate their animals and their farms and their kids and themselves. And people will often question me and on Twitter, which is where people seem to interact the most at times, and say, how do you know that? How do you know that we're going to have to be evacuated? And it leads to me doing these posts every other day or every even few hours, saying, here's where I get my information from, and here's how I collect it. I talk to fire chiefs. I get intel from people on the ground. I use scanner feeds. I listen to 10 of them at once. Somehow I get, photographs from citizen journalists. I mean, there's so many ways. And to me, the transparency regarding that makes people feel better. It makes them trust you even more. And it's part of that media literacy and fighting that misinformation, which we've gotten so used to in the past few years. Because yes, there is fire misinformation,
So I've got another question from Jerry Von Leeuwen, who writes, the loss of subscribers drove advertisers away from newspapers. Are people just not seeking news? Is the nonprofit news sector seeing increases in readers?
Yeah, I think one thing that's really important to understand is that subscriptions always made up a far smaller percentage of newspaper profits than people may realize. So, you paying your $7 a month or whatever it might be to the Philadelphia Inquirer, I grew up in the Philadelphia area, that is not what was funding, the investigative team being able to go to far-flung countries and report on, what was happening in war zones, or even what was happening, with some meltdown at the school board. Subscriptions were always important, but they were never a major revenue driver. It was advertising.
And just name that there was also like huge churn operations around subscriptions, right? Like there was an expectation that people would drop. And I mean, when I was a kid, I delivered the Daily Herald in the suburbs of Chicago, like on my bike. And they used to, now this is like shocking to me, they used to like drop us in new subdivisions, and we'd go like door knock. I'm like an 11-year-old, like door knocking strangers, to sell them the newspaper. And so you were establishing, yes, a baseline of subscribers, but Tasmeen's 100% right. Like it was that was like what that was like your selling language, right? Your readership or your pass through, but it was not what drove the actual funding of the organization.
Right, absolutely.
And more
absolutely.
people than ever are reading. That's the irony. You know, that's the irony. It's not that people aren't reading. It's that the advertisers, here's the thing about advertising. Like, you know, it was always kind of a trust fall, right? You advertise, you buy your page of advertising in the whatever, you know, the San Francisco Chronicle, and like, you know, you're some kind of, you're a furniture store, and like you think that like the foot traffic you get after that Sunday advertising is related to the ad. Who knows? Like, they didn't know for sure, right? And now, like, they can target, like, I know we all are like followed around the world by, you know, the ads that like get us on social media. And so advertisers found a much more effective way of reaching specifically the people they wanted to talk to. And that's when that whole business model fall apart.
You know, they call it, it's like digital dimes to print dollars, right? Like, when you could charge for advertising, if you could charge $1 for a print ad, you can only charge a dime. And it's actually much, much less than that. That's just an analogy for a digital advertisement. And Megan's exactly right. More people than ever are actually reading. But there's a huge imbalance there in terms of what you can charge for a digital ad, because you know, with print advertising, you were only going to print in the local paper. Now you can, with digital ads, target a vast and endless array of, you know, digital spaces. So what you're asking about, you know, in terms of the loss of readers, I think it's just fundamentally important to understand readership and subscriptions never actually funded journalism. More people are reading than ever, whether we're talking about for-profit or nonprofit journalism organizations. And lastly, advertising simply is not going to be the way forward for the vast majority of local news operations, because the market dynamic just it's once you lose that monopoly over, you know, captive audiences, you no longer can rely on advertising to fill.
I'm trying to remember the stat on Facebook and Google. They eat up like 95%, I think, something like that, of all digital. I mean, it's like, it's beyond Goliath, right? I mean, it's like, just, you know, and I think and that's why there's been conversation about that, because I mean, they are conduits, right, for other people's content. I mean, Twitter's not producing content. The world is producing content. Like, Facebook's not producing content. The world is producing content. And they have gotten really, really wealthy on everyone else's content.
Yeah. So like market solutions, you know, we've just got to get away from the idea that we're going to be applying market solutions to, you know, the civic public good output of journalism. Again, if you're the New York Times, if you're the Washington Post, you're going to be fine. It's that middle tier of major metros. I think I am really interested to see what happens to the Philadelphia Inquirer, the Chicago Tribune, the Salt Lake City Tribune, actually. I think I'm getting their name right. The Salt Lake City Tribune, this was a very interesting case, like 3 years ago or so, applied, like lobbied the IRS to become a nonprofit organization. And what they said was, don't make us change anything. Don't tell us you need to retool, you know, what you do, because what we've done has always been a public good. It just used to be profitable. We're going to make the case to the IRS that we should be allowed to go from being a for-profit entity to a nonprofit entity with no discernible change in what we're doing. And this was a test case. This was kind of like a, you know, litmus test kind of situation. And they did it. The IRS granted them nonprofit status. And this, I think we're going to see a lot more of the mid-sized, you know, regional metros go that route. And I hope we do.
So we're about at time. And I just want to thank all of you for sharing your insights today. And I want to thank the audience for listening and for asking really good questions. I believe Kristen is going to put an email in the chat where you can stay in touch or follow up on any questions you didn't get answered. And thank you all so much.